Now, what stands out to you in this declaration?
Well, it's all men are created equal, but what about slavery? How did they reconcile? Are you going to address that?
Well, not necessarily here, but I can. In other words, it's not part of the lesson, but slavery is one of the things that people really have a problem with. You know, a lot of times when they talk about the founders, they'll talk about those rich white slaveholders, you know, or those bigots, or they'll say because they held slaves, everything they said was null and void, because how could you say this and still hold slavery? Well, there's a lot of different perspectives to have with that. One perspective I would point you to is Dinesh D'Souza, the author. He created the movie America recently out in theaters, but he also wrote a book called What's So Great About America, and I recommend that book. But in that, he addresses one of the perspectives of slavery, and he says that we in 2014, we in this modern era, we look back on slavery and we say, how could we have done that? How could America have had these great principles and yet had slavery? But see, we are looking back from a modern time and we're sort of imposing our context on that time. But Dinesh D'Souza talks about the fact that slavery had been around since the beginning of time, essentially. That essentially every culture in the world had some form of slavery. And that it was all over the world, that it was pretty much universal. The unique thing about America was it set into its government the foundation for it to be abolished. So essentially we look back and say, how could we have ever done it? But we in fact were not unique. We were just another country that at some point had slavery. The unique thing about America is we got rid of it.
Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt.
Exactly, out of slavery. Exactly. Well, the other thing is this was not a white Anglo against black African thing. Where did the slaves come from? Well, they had black slave owners selling other black Africans to us. Yep. So in other words, this wasn't white colonists oppressing Africans. This was a worldwide thing that had been going on since essentially the beginning of civilization. Now, it is true that at that time they had slaves. A lot of them did. A lot of them in the South had slavery. It was part of their culture. It was part of their life. Even the Virginia slaveholders, Jefferson and Washington, etc., they hated slavery. They abhorred it. It's since been brought up that there are even laws which prohibited Virginia slaveholders from actually getting or letting their slaves free. And so in various states they even had laws prohibiting.
They did. Yeah,
they even had laws prohibiting the emancipation of a person's personal slaves. So essentially, if you were here in certain states, you were forced. If you had slaves, you couldn't let them go. So it is an issue to address slavery and the founders, etc. And in fact, many of these founders wanted to do away with slavery immediately. In other words, they said, we do not want to create a new country with slavery. But when they were in that constitutional convention, some of those southern state delegates said, if you get rid of it now, we're out of here. And so basically they had to make a very tough decision and say, we can stand our ground with 100% absolute principle and not have a country, or we can make provisions for it to be abolished 100% later and at least start off with a country. So that's what they chose to do. So they actually made laws saying upon this certain date you can't import any more slaves, and they continued to make measures to completely abolish slavery. But essentially what these founders had to do was decide, well, do we want to stand on our ground and not have a country, or compromise a little bit in the short term so that in the long term we can have what we want? And that's what they chose to do.